The morning of the dispersal sale, there were 120 skinny sheep nobody wanted, penned in the back lot behind the auction barn, where the light came down hard and unkind, and the dust rose off their thin backs every time one of them shifted. And the crowd that had gathered for the fat lambs and the good black cattle up front did not so much as glance toward the rear pens, except to shake their heads and move on, because these were culls, the leftovers of a widow's estate, a flock of some old breed nobody raised anymore, small and rangy and knock-kneed, their wool matted and full of burrs, their ribs plain as fence rails under coats gone the color of dirty snow, and the auctioneer himself had already given up on them, listing them as one lot to clear the pen, and he said the number twice into the microphone with a flatness that told everyone what he thought they were worth. And nobody raised a hand, and the flies moved in the heat, and 120 animals stood there, waiting to be told they were finished. She walked past the fat lambs. She walked past the polled Herefords with their bright eyes and their glossy hides. She walked past the men leaning on the top rail with their coffee and their opinions, and she walked all the way to the back, to the pen nobody wanted to stand near, and she leaned her forearms on the gate, and she looked at the 120 for a long time without saying anything, the way a person reads a page slowly, because it matters. And one of the ewes came to the gate and put her narrow head against the woman's hand, and the woman did not pull the hand away. Her name was Wren, and she was 28 years old. She had long, straight black hair pulled back into a low braid that fell over one shoulder, and olive skin the sun had darkened to the color of a saddle, and dark brown eyes that did not move much, and a faint pale scar through the tail of her right eyebrow, and she wore a cream Henley worn soft at the collar, under a rust-brown canvas chore jacket, and there were leather gloves folded into the back pocket of her dark jeans, and her boots were brown and caked to the ankle, with the mud of a place 3 counties over, and she was tall and wiry and stronger than she looked, and when she raised her hand at last, it was not a wave and not a flourish. It was just a hand lifted plainly into the still air, and the auctioneer paused, because he had not expected it, and he said the number a third time, as if to give her a chance to take it back, and she did not take it back, and the sheep were hers. A man laughed. He was a big man in a clean straw hat and a pressed shirt, and his name was Cal Renner, and he ran 4,000 head of good commercial ewes on the best bottomland in the valley, and he was the kind of man whose laugh carried because he had spent his life being agreed with. And he said, loud enough for the whole back lot to hear, that he'd seen a lot of ways to lose money, but he'd never seen a girl pay cash for a pen of coyote dinners, and the men on the rail laughed with him because it was easier than not, and he said she'd be feeding those bags of bones all winter just to bury them in the spring, and that the smartest thing she could do was drive them straight to the renderer and save herself the hay. And he tipped his clean hat at her, the way a man tips his hat when he means the opposite of courtesy, and it would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely, though not one soul standing in that lot could have known it then. Wren looked at him with those steady eyes, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not defend herself. She only said, "That's one approach," and she turned back to the pen and began the slow work of counting them again, with her lips barely moving, 1 and 2 and 3, all the way to 120, and the men drifted off toward the good cattle, and Cal Renner told the story twice on his way to his truck, because it was too good not to tell, and by the time he reached the highway, it had already begun to travel. And I want to stop here for just a moment, because a story like this one only lives if people carry it, and if you know what it feels like to be the one at the back of the lot with your hand in the air while everybody laughs. Do me a small favor and tap that like button, and leave a comment telling me the name of the town or the city or the country you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one of them, and it matters to me to know where in the world these stories land. Now, back to the girl and her 120. She loaded them herself, in a borrowed stock trailer hitched behind a failing brown truck that had a hitch in its idle, a truck so old and so tired that when it sat running at a stoplight, it seemed to compose its own obituary, coughing and settling and coughing again. And she made 3 trips because the trailer only held 40 at a time, and the sun was down behind the ridgeline before the last load stood swaying in the dark, and she drove them home slow over gravel roads that climbed and turned, to a place she had not planned to come back to, a place she had inherited by the plain arithmetic of having nowhere else to be. Because that is the thing the men on the rail did not know about her, that 6 weeks before she had been 1,000 miles away, with a life that had come apart in her hands, a job gone, and a man gone, and a small rented life folded up into the bed of a truck, and there had been a certificate somewhere in a box, a piece of paper that said she knew how to do a thing she had never once been paid to do. And when the letter came saying the old family place had passed to her, the last of a line thinning out to a single name, she had not thought about it for long. She had simply pointed the truck at the mountains and driven until the pavement gave out. The place, when she reached it, was mostly emptiness, dressed up as a farm. There was a house with a porch that leaned, and a barn that leaned the other way, as if the two of them had agreed to hold each other up across the yard. And there were outbuildings with their doors hanging, and fences that had gone to suggestion, 3 strands of rusted wire looping between posts that a hard lean would put on the ground, and there was grass. But it was the wrong kind of grass, in the wrong places, thin bunch grass on the high ground, and a mat of weeds down in the flats, and there was no creek to speak of, only a dry cut where a creek had once run, a channel of pale stones that the old maps still called Willow Branch, though there had been no willows and no branch in living memory. The county called this the dry side of the valley. Cal Renner called it, when he called it anything, the part of the map God forgot to finish. Nothing green stayed green up here past the middle of June, and everyone who had ever tried to run stock on it had run out of water by August, and had either hauled it in by the tankload at a cost that ate them alive, or had sold out and moved down to the bottomland where the springs were, and the last person to try had been an old man 3 generations back, and after him the family had mostly rented the ground to a neighbor who grazed it hard in the wet spring, and left it alone the rest of the year, and let the house lean, and let the barn lean, and let Willow Branch stay dry. Wren turned the 120 into the home pasture that first night, with nothing but starlight and a flashlight held in her teeth, and she watched them fan out over the dark ground, and put their heads down and begin to eat, and she stood at the sagging gate a long while, listening to the sound of 120 animals tearing grass, which is a sound like rain that does not stop, and she thought about the winter coming, and the water that would not, and she did not feel afraid exactly. She felt the way a person feels at the bottom of a long climb, which is to say, she felt the size of it. She did not have a plan. She had a certificate she had never used, and a truck that was dying, and a pen of sheep the whole valley had already buried, and she had a place that could not water them, and she had, though she did not know it yet, one thing more, which was a great deal more than it looked to be. That first week, she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was the next thing, and the next thing after that. She walked the fences with a spool of wire and a fence tool, and she spliced what could be spliced, and she flagged what could not, and she found in the barn a coil of good wire the neighbor had never used, and she found tools hung on nails in the exact order a careful man leaves them, and she found, in the tack room where the light came through a knothole in a thin gold bar, a wooden feed box with a hasp but no lock, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a stack of ledgers. There were 9 of them, bound in cracked black board, and they smelled of dust and mice and old leather. And when she opened the first one, the handwriting inside was small and slanted and patient, a hand that never hurried and never lifted from the discipline of the line. And across the top of the first page, dated in a year that made her do the arithmetic twice, was written a name she knew from a single photograph in the house, A stern, narrow man in a collarless shirt, standing in front of a barn, her great-grandfather, and under his name he had written a sentence she read 3 times, standing there in the gold bar of light. A sentence he had gone back and underlined once, firmly, so the pen had nearly torn the page, and the sentence said, "When the sky quits, the ground remembers." She did not know yet what it meant. She closed the ledger, and she carried all 9 of them to the house, and she set them on the kitchen table, and that night by the light of a lamp she began to read, and what she found in those pages was not a diary and not a memoir. It was a working record, a man's argument set down in ink over 40 years, an argument for a way of doing things that the whole world had decided was worthless. He had run this same breed, the small rangy sheep with the coarse long wool, and he had run them on purpose, and he had written down why. He wrote that the fat modern sheep were bred for a world that had water, and that this ground was not that world, and that a sheep for this ground had to be a sheep that could walk far and eat rough and go dry, and keep its lambs alive on nothing, and that the breed everybody laughed at was the breed that had crossed the plains and climbed the mountains, and outlived every fashion that had ever replaced it. And he wrote that their wool, the long, coarse wool nobody wanted for cheap suits, was the wool the hand spinners and the rug makers and the old mills paid dear for when you could find it clean. And he wrote a thing she circled with her own pen that night, that a poor animal is only a rich animal that has been fed wrong, and under that he had drawn a small, careful map. The map filled a whole page near the back of the 4th ledger, and it was drawn the way a man draws a thing he means to be believed, with distances stepped off in paces and marked in his small hand, and it showed the home place and the leaning barn, and the dry cut of willow branch, and it showed the high bunch-grass ground and the weedy flats, and down in the far low corner of the back pasture, in a fold of ground below a rock shelf where nothing grew but a dark ring of sedge that Wren had walked past a dozen times without a thought, he had drawn a small circle, and inside the circle he had written 2 words, and the 2 words were the low corner, and beside the circle, connected to it by a firm line, he had written a longer note in the technical, unhurried voice he used when he was certain, and the note said that the water in this country did not run on top where a man could see it and be fooled. It ran under, in the seams of the rock, and that in the dry years when the creeks lied and went to stone, the water was still there, down, and that a man could find where it wanted to come up by watching where the ground stayed dark and the sedge stayed green 3 weeks after everything around it had burned off, and that his own father had dug there once and hit sweet water at a depth he gave in feet, and that he had capped it and left it because in his day the creek ran and he had no need of it, but that he had built no pond and dug no well up on the high ground where a sensible man would have, because, he wrote, and here the ink pressed hard again, I built the wrong kind of barn on purpose. I put nothing where the eye expects it, and everything where the ground allows it, and when the sky quits, the ground remembers. She sat with that a long time. Outside the window, the leaning barn stood black against the stars, built low and wrong on the high, dry ground where no barn should be, and she understood for the first time that it had not been built by a fool. It had been built by a man, reading a page she was only now learning to read, and she felt something settle onto her shoulders in the lamplight. Not a burden exactly, but a weight with a shape to it. The way a coat settles when someone lays it across your back on a cold night. And she did not go and dig in the low corner the next morning, or the morning after, because it was October, and the sheep were thin, and there was hay to find and fence to fix, and 120 animals to bring through a winter, and the water, if it was there, had waited 80 years, and could wait a little longer. There was one more person on that place, and Wren had not mentioned her to the men at the sale, and would not have thought to. In a small back bedroom of the leaning house, lived her great-aunt Odessa, who was 91 years old and had lived on that ground her whole life and had buried everyone who came before, and who said perhaps a tenth of what she thought and offered the rest of it, when she offered it at all, as a fact laid quietly on the table for another person to pick up or leave. She wore the same faded work dress and the same brown cardigan she had worn for 30 years, and she sat by the window with a basket of mending or a bowl of peas or a length of knitting, and she watched a great deal more than she spoke. When Wren had come home, Odessa had said only, "So you came," and Wren had said, "I came," and that had been the whole of it. But the night after Wren found the map, she brought the fourth ledger to the old woman's chair, and she opened it to the low corner, and she asked, "Did he really find water down there?" And Odessa did not look at the page. She looked out the window toward the dark fold of ground she could not have seen, even in daylight, from that chair. And she was quiet for the length of time the question had earned. And then she said, "He kept this whole place for these." And Wren said, "For what?" And Odessa said, "For the ones nobody wanted. That's what these ridges are. That's what this water is. That's what that barn is. Everything on this hill is built for the animal the valley throws away." And she picked her knitting back up, and the needles began again. And she said, without turning her head, as a fact offered for consideration and nothing more, "He always said the day would come, the valley would need what it laughed at." And then she said, "No more." And Wren understood that she had been given something, and that the something would not be repeated. And she carried the ledger back to the kitchen, and she did not sleep much, and in the morning she went out to the thin, cold sheep with their burr-matted wool, and she looked at them differently, the way you look at a thing when you have just been told what it is for. The first winter was the hardest labor of her life, and she rendered it hour by hour. She could not afford the good alfalfa the valley fed, so she bought coarse grass hay from a man clearing an old barn, and she stretched it with the standing bunch grass on the high ground, moving the flock in tight bunches behind a single strand of temporary wire, the way the ledgers told her to, one small piece of ground at a time. So the sheep ate it clean, and dunged it even, and moved on before they could ruin it, which the ledgers called folding, and which the neighbor who had grazed the place loose for years would have called a foolish amount of walking. And she walked it, every day, in the sleet and the short light, opening the wire and calling them through, and closing it behind. And the old man in the ledgers had written that a sheep of this breed would keep its flesh on rough feed if you moved it before it fouled its ground, that the secret was not richer feed but cleaner ground, and more of it. And slowly, over the black weeks of December, the thing he promised began to happen. The burrs grew out and were shorn away at the edges. The matted wool lifted and showed cleaner staple underneath. The ribs, which had stood out like the rungs of a ladder, began to soften under a layer of condition that came not from grain, of which she fed almost none, but from the endless patient moving over the rough ground that these animals had been bred 100 years to thrive on. By the end of the 3rd week they knew her voice. By the end of the 5th week they knew the sound of the wire reel and came at a trot when they heard it. By the end of the 7th week, the thinnest of them, a ewe she had privately marked as the one least likely to see spring, had put on enough flesh that Wren stopped worrying over her at the night check. She did not name them. She had told herself at the sale that she would not name a single one, because they were livestock and not pets, and because a person who names 120 animals is a person setting herself up for 120 small graves, and she held that line through the whole hard winter. She held it through the lambing that came early in a February storm, when she was out in the dark with a lantern and her sleeves pushed up, pulling lambs and rubbing them warm and setting them to the teat. She held that line through all of it. She almost held that line. There was one ewe, the very one who had come to the sale barn gate and put her head in Wren's hand, an older ewe with a black patch over one eye like a thumbprint, who lammed twins in that February storm and lost her footing on the ice, and would have laid down and quit if Wren had not stayed with her the whole of one night. On her knees in the freezing straw, holding the ewe's head up and talking to her low. And when the sun came, the ewe stood, and both lambs lived. And Wren, who had held the line against 119, looked at that one and said, "All right, Patch," and that was the end of the line, and Patch she stayed. Word of the girl on the dry side got around that winter, the way word gets around in a place like that, through the store and the gas pump and the beauty shop, and the person who carried it was a woman named Marlene who ran the register at the Crossroads store, and who was, in the way of such women, the beating heart of the whole valley's knowing, the one artery through which every piece of news passed on its way to becoming common property. And Marlene told it first as comedy, the girl who paid money for the widow's culls and hauled them up to the dry hill to starve, and Cal Renner kept the joke fed every time he came in for his mail, asking after the coyote population and whether it had gone up now that the buffet had moved to town, and the men laughed, and it cost Wren nothing, because she almost never came down off the hill, and when she did, she said little, and bought less, and drove her dying truck home. But somewhere in the deep of that winter, the joke began, very quietly, to change its shape, because the man who cut Wren's hay came into the store and said, offhand, that those sheep of hers weren't dying, that in fact, he'd never seen a set of culls come around like that on grass hay, and no grain, and Marlene filed it away. And a week later the vet who'd been called up the hill for a hard lambing said the same thing in his own words, that the girl knew what she was doing with a lambing knife, and that her flock was in better condition than half the fat commercial ewes in the bottom, and Marlene filed that away too, and a story that changes even 1 degree in a place that small does not go back to where it was. Spring came up the dry side slow and grudging, the way it always did, and the high ground greened for a few bright weeks and then, right on the calendar, began to brown, and by the middle of June the valley was doing what the valley did, which was watching the sky, because the winter had come light, and the snowpack in the mountains had been thin, and the men in the bottomland, who had never once worried about water in their lives, began, that year, to worry, and the creeks came down early and low, and by the first week of July, Willow Branch was what it always was, a channel of pale stones, and the springs the whole valley depended on ran thin, and the county extension man used the word drought in the newspaper for the first time in 11 years. Wren had been ready for it since October. She had spent the mild weeks of spring not resting, but working the low corner, and the work had been slow and mostly alone, because she would not borrow money to hire it done. And here is a thing that must be said plainly about her, that when the bank in town, hearing there was a young woman up on the old place, sent a man out to offer her an operating loan, a friendly line of credit to buy grain and fence and hire help and grow the thing properly, she had listened to the whole of his pitch standing on her leaning porch, and then she had said, "No thank you," and when he pressed her, as such men do, and told her she'd never grow at any speed worth having, without leverage, she had said a thing her great-grandfather had written in the 7th Ledger, and that she had underlined herself. She had said, "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and I'd rather ask it than tell it." And the banker had not known what to say to that, and had driven off, and she had grown only as fast as the work could bear, and not one animal faster. So she dug the low corner by hand, and by the light of the ledger's map, following the old man's paces down below the rock shelf to the dark ring of sedge that had stayed green 3 full weeks after the ground around it went to straw, exactly as he had written, and she dug where the sedge was greenest, and 2 feet down the soil turned dark and cool against the back of her hand, and 4 feet down it turned to mud, And at the depth the old man had named in his small, certain hand, she came to a cap of flat stones, laid by a man 80 years dead, laid deliberately over a place where the water wanted to rise. And when she lifted the last of the stones, the water came up into the hole, clear and cold and steady, and it did not stop. It filled the hole, and it went on filling it, and it began to run off in a thin, bright thread, down the fold of ground, toward the dead channel of Willow Branch. And Wren knelt there in the mud, with her hands in the cold of it, and she did not shout, and she did not weep. She cupped a handful, and she drank it, and it was sweet. And she looked up at the dark fold of ground where the sedge stayed green, and she said, out loud, to no one, or to the old man, the ground remembers, and she said it the way you finish another person's sentence, and then she got up and went to work making it hold. She lined the pool with stone, and she ran a pipe from it. On the fall of the land, the old man's numbers doing the arithmetic, to a low tank in the back pasture, and by the time the drought had the valley by the throat, in the last dead weeks of July, while the men in the bottomland were hauling water in tank trucks, at a cost that was breaking them one load at a time, and while the good commercial ewes on Cal Renner's best bottomland were being sold off early in a falling market because he could not water them, up on the dry side that God forgot to finish, there was a spring running clear and cold into a stone tank, and 120 small rangy sheep and their lambs drinking their fill, standing in the one green fold of ground for miles. And the story that came down off that hill and into Marlene's store was no longer a joke, it was a wonder, and it traveled faster than the mockery ever had. It was Cal Renner himself who broke it in the end, though he did not make a large production out of it. He had held out longer than the rest, because a man like that has more than water invested in being right. But the drought did not care what he had invested, and by the middle of August, he had shipped nearly a third of his ewes at a loss that would take him 3 good years to climb out of. And one hot morning in September, when the dust hung over the whole valley and the bottomland lay brown as a burnt field, his clean truck came up the gravel road to the leaning place, slow, and he parked it in the yard, and he got out, and he stood there for a minute, turning his straw hat in his hands, which was a thing no one in the valley had ever seen Cal Renner do. And Wren came around the corner of the barn, with her gloves in her back pocket and a smear of grease on her forearm, and she stopped and looked at him, and did not help him with a single word, because she owed him nothing, not even ease. And he looked past her toward the back pasture, where he could see, even from the yard, the impossible green of the watered ground and the sheep on it. And he looked at it a long while, and then he looked at his hat, and he said, I came up here to see it for myself, because I didn't believe it, and now I've seen it. And he stopped, and Wren waited, and he made himself say the rest of it. And he said, I was wrong. At the sale, and every day since, I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about them, and I was wrong about this ground. And I've been ranching this valley for 40 years, and I didn't know there was water up here, and you did. And he shook his head once, and he said, How did you know? And Wren looked at him for a moment, and then she said the truest thing she could have said. She said, I didn't. A man who's been dead 80 years knew. I just read what he wrote down. And Cal Renner turned that over, and then he asked if he could see the spring, and she took him back, and showed him the stone pool in the fold of ground, and the pipe and the tank, and he crouched down and put his hand in the cold water the way she had, and he was quiet. And when he stood up, he did not offer her advice, and he did not offer her a loan, and he did not tell her how she ought to expand. He only put his hat back on, and he said, If you ever want to sell any of those ewes, the ones bred to go dry, I'd stand at the front of the line, and I'd pay what they're worth. And he meant it, and that was his whole conversion, done standing in the mud, in the space of 5 minutes, no ceremony. And he drove his clean truck back down the hill. And by the time he reached the store, the story had changed its final degree, from wonder into something like respect. And Marlene, who had launched the mockery into the world a year before, now launched the correction with the same tireless energy, and the valley began, slowly, the way a valley does, to correct its own judgment about the girl on the dry side and the sheep nobody wanted. The word went out along other channels too, quieter ones, the channels that carry not gossip but quality. When Wren sheared that first full clip of the long, coarse wool she had brought clean off the burr and the mat over a year of folding, she did not know where to sell it, and she drove a sample of it 3 hours to a woolen mill she had found in the back of the 9th Ledger. A mill the old man had done business with before the war, still running, barely, under the great-grandson of the man he'd known, and she laid the fleece on the sorting table, and the old sorter there, a man with fingers stained 40 years with lanolin, picked it up and pulled the staple and held it to the light and rolled it against his cheek, and he did not say much. Because men who know a thing do not need to say much, he just looked up at her and said, "Where has this been? We can't get this anymore. Nobody grows it right." And he named a price per pound that made her ask him to say it again, and he said it again, and he told her that the hand spinners and the rug weavers would take every ounce she could grow, and he said, "The way one craftsman certifies another, quietly and with no flourish at all, you have the touch for it." And word of that travelled too, along the wool road, mill to spinner to weaver, never once advertised, until Wren had buyers for a clip 3 times the size of the one she had. The apprentice came the way the important things came on that place, which is to say sideways and unannounced. He was a boy of 15 named Toby, who lived down the road with a family that had too many mouths and too little for any of them to do. And he had started coming up the hill that first summer to watch, hanging on the fence the way Wren herself had hung on the sale barn gate, saying nothing, and one day she had handed him the wire reel without a word, and he had taken it, and moved the sheep as if he had done it his whole life. And she had watched his hands, because she had learned by then that hands tell the truth about a person faster than a mouth ever will, and she had said nothing, but she had let him come back. And by the second summer he was there every day that school allowed, and every hour that it did not, and she paid him a fair wage out of the wool money, and she taught him the way the ledgers had taught her, by the next thing, and the next thing after that, and she treated him from the first day, not as a boy to be trained, but as a hand who was already good, and only needed the ground under him, which is a thing that will make a young person into what you have already decided they are. It was Odessa who named it, though, because Odessa named the true things. She had come out onto the porch one evening in her brown cardigan, which she almost never did anymore, and she had sat and watched Toby bring the flock down off the high ground in the long gold light, moving them slow and easy, the way they liked to be moved, one bare hand out to steady the lead ewe, and Odessa had watched him a long time. And then she had said, to Wren, "That one." And Wren had said, "What about him?" And Odessa had said, "He has the hands." And she had said it as a fact laid quietly on the table. And then she had said the rest of it, which was more than she had said in a year. She had said, "Your great-grandfather could tell in a week which one a place would keep, and which one it would send away. And it was never the loud one, and it was never the clever one. It was always the one with the quiet hands." And she had looked at Toby a while more, and she had said, "That's the one. This place will still have that boy on it when the both of us are gone." And then she had gone back inside to her chair and her knitting, and said no more. And she had been right, as she was right about the small handful of things she chose to speak on. Odessa died the following winter, in her sleep, in the small back bedroom, on a night so cold the water froze in the trough, and Wren was out breaking ice at midnight, and did not know until morning, when she brought the old woman her tea, and found her gone, her hands folded and her face smoothed of all of its 92 years. And Wren stood in the doorway a long moment with the tea going cold in her hands, and then she set it down, and she did what needed doing, because that was the only way she knew to carry a thing that heavy, by doing the next thing, and the next after that. On the dresser, Weighted under a smooth river stone, there was an envelope with Wren's name on it in Odessa's spidery hand, sealed, and Wren did not open it that day. She carried it in the breast pocket of her chore jacket, unopened for a long time, the way you carry a thing you are not ready to be finished with. And she buried her great-aunt on the hill above the house, in the family ground where the old man in the ledgers lay under a stone, worn nearly smooth, and the whole valley came up the dry road for it, every truck the crossroads could produce, and stood in the cold with their hats off. They came, and Wren stood at the head of the grave in her rust-brown jacket, with the wind pulling at the loose black hair around her braid, and she watched them come up the hill, and she named them to herself as they came, the way you take an accounting of a thing you did not know you had. There was Marlene from the store who had carried both the mockery and the wonder, and who was weeping openly. And there was the hayman and the vet, and there was the old wool sorter who had driven 3 hours with his lanolin-stained hands folded in front of him, and there was the county man and the banker, who had once offered her the loan and been refused, and there were a dozen ranch families from the bottomland, whose names she had learned only in the last year, and there, at the back, in a clean straw hat held against his chest, was Cal Renner, who had known Odessa his whole life, and who did not come forward, and did not make a production of it, but stood in the cold and stayed to the end. And Toby stood beside Wren, with his young face set hard against grief, the way boys set their faces. And Wren put her hand on his shoulder, which she had never done before, and left it there, and she understood, standing among all those people who had once laughed and now stood bareheaded in the wind, that she had been accepted into the place, that the ground had taken her the way it takes anything that proves it belongs, slowly and without ceremony and completely. That night, alone at the kitchen table with the 9 ledgers stacked at her elbow and the lamp burning, she took the envelope out of her pocket and she opened it at last, and inside there was a single sheet of paper folded once, and on it, in Odessa's spidery hand, were 2 lines. The first line said, "The place is yours in the courthouse now. I saw to it. Don't let them tell you it isn't." And the second line below it was not Odessa's own words. Wren knew them at once. They were the old man's words, the underlined line from the first ledger, and Odessa had copied them out in her failing hand as the last thing she meant to say. And the line said, "When the sky quits, the ground remembers." And under it, Odessa had added 4 words of her own. "So do the people," and that was all. And Wren sat with it a long time in the lamplight, and she folded it back along its crease, and she put it in the front of the first ledger, where the underlined line already was, so that the 2 of them would lie together, the man's certainty and the old woman's blessing. And she turned off the lamp and she went out and checked the flock in the dark, the way she did every night, and the sheep were bedded down in the fold of green ground above the running spring, and she stood at the gate and listened to them breathe. 120 grown to twice that now, and every one of them descended from the ones nobody wanted, and she went to bed. The years after that ran together the way good years do. 4 of them, 5, the seasons folding into one another, the flock growing only as fast as the water and the grass and the work could carry it, and not one animal faster. No debt, no bank, no grain, just the folding and the moving, and the shearing, and the long coarse wool going out along the quiet road to the mills, and the ewes going, some of them, down to the bottomland where Cal Renner bred them into his own tired commercial flock, to put the dry country hardiness back into blood that had gone soft on easy water. And he came up the hill twice a year to buy them, and he paid what they were worth, and he called Wren by her name, and he had long since stopped telling the story of the sale as a joke, because now when he told it, and he did tell it, he told it as the day he had been the fool at the front of the crowd, and he did not spare himself in the telling, and there was a kind of honor in that, in a proud man choosing to be the fool of his own story, so that the true thing could stand. Toby grew up on that hill exactly as Odessa had said he would, and by the time he was 20 he ran the folding and the lambing and the shearing crew, and his hands had become the hands the old woman had seen in them when he was 15, and Wren taught him to read the ledgers, all 9 of them, and she taught him to find the dark ground and the green sedge, and she taught him that a poor animal is only a rich animal fed wrong, and she taught him the underlined line. And one dry August, when the creeks went to stone again, and the valley remembered to be afraid, it was Toby, not Wren, who walked out to a new fold of ground on a piece of the place they had never watered, and found the dark ring of sedge staying green 3 weeks after everything around it had burned, and dug there, and hit sweet water, and came back up to the house with his hands muddy, and his young face doing a thing it rarely did, which was smile, and said only, "The ground remembers," and Wren looked at him and said, "Those are the ones," meaning the hands, meaning him, meaning the whole long line of it handed forward, and it was enough. The morning she closed the loop, there were 120 fat, healthy sheep the whole valley wanted, and Wren stood at the same sail barn gate she had leaned on 8 years before, but this time she stood on the other side of it, because this time the 120 were hers to sell. Top-conditioned ewes off the dry side, the get of the flock nobody had wanted, and the pens were not at the back of the lot in the harsh, unkind light. They were up front where the good animals go, and the crowd that had once turned away was pressed 3 deep against the rail to see them, and the auctioneer, the same man, said the opening number, with a respect in his voice that no one had to teach him, and the bidding did not stop where it started. It climbed, hand over hand over hand, and it climbed past what anyone in that barn had ever paid for a pen of sheep in living memory, and when the hammer finally fell, the number was so far beyond the number she had paid for the culls that a man on the rail whistled low, and Wren did not smile, and did not weep. She felt instead the thing that comes at the end of a long climb, which is older and quieter than triumph, a kind of settling, a debt paid to people who were not there to see it paid. Because that was why she had come, that was the whole of why she had loaded the truck and made the drive, not for the money, though the money was more than fair, but because 8 years before, at this same barn, in this same lot, a man had laughed and predicted funerals and coyote dinners, and that prediction had turned out to be a prediction of something else entirely. It had predicted its own overturning, and Wren had promised herself, kneeling in the mud the day the spring came up, that she would one day stand in the front pens of this barn, with the descendants of the ones they laughed at, and let the valley bid against itself to own a piece of what it had thrown away. And now she had done it. And Cal Renner was there, of course, in his clean straw hat gone soft with the years, and he was the one who bid the hammer price, and when it fell he caught her eye across the crowd, and he did not tip his hat the false way he had tipped it 8 years before. He took it off, all the way off, and he held it against his chest, and he nodded once, slow, and she nodded back, and the loop closed, quietly, the way the true things on that place had always closed, without ceremony. She drove home that evening in a truck that ran clean, the old dying brown one long since retired to the barn, where it sat like a monument, and Toby was at the home place with the rest of the flock, and the spring ran cold in the low corner where an 80-year-old map had said it would, and the light came down long and gold over the one green fold of ground for miles, and she stood at the gate and listened to them tear the grass, a sound like rain that does not stop, and she thought about the man in the ledgers who had built the wrong kind of barn on purpose and been proven right by a great-granddaughter he never met, and about the old woman who had said so do the people, and she understood that she had lived long enough to watch the whole world correct itself about a thing she had believed in when no one else would, and that this, and not the hammer price, was the thing worth the 8 years. And that is where I'll leave her, at the gate in the gold light, because the story is really hers to finish, and not mine to end. But before you go, I want to ask you to do 2 small things, if the story meant anything to you tonight. Send it to someone you know who has been underestimated, someone who was told that the thing they have, or the thing they are, is worth nothing. Someone standing at the back of the lot with their hand in the air while the crowd laughs, because they might need to hear tonight that worth does not have to argue. It only has to outlast the laughing. And then leave me a comment, and tell me about the stubborn thing in your own life, the one people laughed at, the sheep everyone told you to send to the renderer, the dry hill everyone said God forgot to finish, the thing you kept anyway because some quiet part of you could read a page the others couldn't. And tell me whether the ground has remembered yet, or whether you're still out there in the dry year, digging in the low corner by the light of an old map, waiting for the water to come up sweet and cold into your hands. Because it does come up, more often than the loud and certain ones will ever admit. The rejected thing is the valuable thing, when you know how to read it. Patience beats money, and attention beats force, and the ground remembers. And so, if you give it long enough, do the people